and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if this is your first time. Please don't forget to like, share and leave a comment even. It'd be nice to have some comments from you. Today we're talking about the lady with the lamp. On her 203rd birthday, Florence Nightingale's story is an amazing one. She is one of the most inspirational women of all time. Named after the city she was born on the 12th of May 1820 to her parents William Shaw Nightingale and Frances Fanny Nightingale. Florence was the younger of two sisters. Her mother was from a family of merchants and took pride in socialising with other prominent members of society. Frances was different. From her mother, she never valued high society in the same way. Florence's father, William, was a wealthy landowner who had inherited two estates, one in Derbyshire and one in Lea in Hampshire, which is where Florence spent much of her childhood. Her father taught both girls a classical education. Florence was a very well-read and accomplished mathematician and could speak well in several languages. Florence was said to have a philanthropic nature from early childhood, always wanting to help local people if they fell ill. And by the age of 16, she was sure she was destined to be a nurse, believing it was her calling from God. Her parents were not as enthusiastic. Back in those times, nursing was not a profession. It was as recognised as it is today. That is one of Florence's legacies. In those days, nursing was looked down on, and any woman that did work as a nurse was not the sort of lady that would have walked in the same circles as Florence and her family. Often the women would work for mere pennies to survive hand to mouth. They weren't very caring or worried too much about the hygiene, etc. Hospitals were not clean and organised like they are today. This too, another legacy of Florence, along with the compassion she established to the patients. Florence was sent on a year-long holiday. It was largely hoped that whilst travelling Europe she would forget her own dream of becoming a nurse. While Florence was away, after realising Frances's dream would not fade, her father decided to support her. She went to Germany to train and be taught at Kaiserwerth at the institution of Protestant deaconesses, thought to be the best nurses of the time. The nurses were actually nuns working from a convent. When she came back, her father continued to support her to the sum of £500 a year, which back then was a small fortune. In the early 1850s, she returned to London, where she began a nursing position in Middlesex. Her attribute for the position impressed her employer so much, she was promoted in her first year to the superintendent. The position was challenging and difficult as it coincided with the cholera outbreak, which made worse by the unsanitary conditions, spreading the disease rapidly. Florence dedicated herself to improving the hygiene practices and the sanitation. This significantly reduced the death toll in the hospitals. It sadly took a toll on Florence's health though. By October 1853, the Crimean War broke out. The British were at war with the Russians over the control of the Ottoman Empire. Thousands of British soldiers were sent to the Black Sea. By 1854, 18,000 soldiers or more had been admitted to military hospitals. At that time in Crimea, there were no female nurses. The War Office avoided hiring women due to the previous poor reputations. However, after the Battle of Alma, England was in uproar over the neglect and lack of sufficient medical treatment of the sick and injured troops. The hospital were extremely understaffed and extremely unsanitary. Late 1854, Florence was requested by her friend, the Secretary of War, Sidney Herbert, to assemble a corps of nurses to take them to the war to tend to the sick and the fallen troops. Florence quickly assembled a group of 37 nurses from a variety of different religions and departed for Scutari. Days later, when they arrived, none of them could have been prepared for what they were about to find. Despite all the warnings they had been given, the reality was far, far worse. While she was visiting Greece, she showed that her compassion knew no bounds, and extended to animals too. While she was there, she came across an injured owl that some local boys had been tormenting, so she rescued the little owl and nursed it back to health. She named the little patient Athena, and it is said that she travelled everywhere with her, spending a lot of time in Florence's pocket. The hospital in Scutari, Constantinople, was found to sat in a large cesspool. A dead horse was even found in the well, contaminating their water. Patients lay in the hallway on the floors in their own excrements. There were infestations of insects and rodents. The hospital lacked basic supplies such as bandages and soap and even beds. But to Francis's annoyance, Britain had sent such supplies, but for a clerical error of a lack of signature, they were still sat on the docks, waiting. So she used her political friends to get that sorted. Next, Florence had to deal with the head doctor, Dr. John Hall, the chief army medic, who didn't like Florence and didn't want her and her nurses there. He thought it was no place for a woman and couldn't see the point of having nurses there. Dr. Hall forbade Florence and her team from helping, so she did. She told her team not to help the doctors unless they asked, and instead set them to work cleaning the hospital, even employing the assistance of less ill or injured patients, by employing the tactics of only helping the doctors when they asked. In the long run, this gave her more power with them. After a short time, the hospital now has order and hygiene. Dr. Hall still wasn't completely sold on the idea of her being there, though, and this is where she earned her nickname we all know her by, the Lady with the Lamp. This was because after the doctors and the soldiers went to bed, Florence would walk the miles of the hallways, the sick and the injured, showing them compassion, rarely seen in any hospital settling at this time, let alone a military hospital. She would sit with them and speak to them, hold their hands for comfort. Compassion is another of Florence Nightingale's many legacies to nursing. Another thing Florence did off her own back was to write to the families and loved ones of the soldiers that had died, to let them know what had become of them. Something nobody had done before. She also worked with the Bank of Scotland to put a system in place for the soldiers' wages to be sent home to their wives and children. Again, something not done before. Soldiers started to call her the Angel of Crimea. She was horrified at their treatment. She saw firsthand what they were giving for their country, and her care and compassion was her way of giving it back. Not only did Florence and her nurses reduce the death toll by 2/3, but they also introduced other patient services, Contributing to improvements during her admission, she implemented the creation of the invalid kitchen, which gave special dietary requirements. She introduced a laundry to ensure clean linen. She also introduced a library and a classroom for intellectual stimulation for patients. Florence, although caring and compassionate, was not a fragile flower. She could be stern and a formidable opponent. In the Florence Nightingale Museum, the Scutari Hospital nursing register can be seen, with nurses' names and details and reasons for dismissals, such as drunken behaviour or flirting with patients. She insisted on proper behaviour at all times and was a stickler for personal hygiene practices as well as the hospitals. Florence wrote about all she had seen and experienced during her time in Scutari Hospital in an 830-page report. Notes on the matters affecting the health efficiency and the hospital administration of the British Army. The report analysed Florence's experiences, gave proposals of reforms for other military hospitals operating under poor conditions. The report completely revitalised military hospitals, sparking a complete reconstruction in 1857. Another introduction and legacy of Florence's is the nurse's uniform. She introduced the Scutari sash individually so the nurses were easy to identify for their safety as well as the soldiers. Florence was the last nurse to leave Scutari in 1856 when the war was over. She returned home under the name of Mrs. Smith, as she was worried she would return to a massive fanfare. She wouldn't have been right. When she arrived home, she travelled by train up to Derbyshire, then walked a couple of miles from the station to her family home, where she completely collapsed. Florence had lost a lot of weight. It's thought at the time she was suffering brucellosis, an illness commonly caught from eating unpasteurised food. It affects in general malaise and constant feeling of being completely drained. This would affect her from the rest of her life, having periods of being bedridden. This would be when her focus would shift from being an active nurse to a campaigner and a strategist. She would spend the next 50 years working, mostly from her bed, trying to ensure that nursing practices were top-notch, even summoning prime ministers of the time to her bedside to tell them what they should be doing to improve care for the British people. But I've jumped ahead of myself a bit. As I said, Florence was worried about coming home from Crimea to a fanfare, and she was right to be. Florence wasn't a fan of being front and centre stage. She was quite reclusive, unlike her mother and sister, who took it upon themselves to be her own PR team. She was met with a hero's welcome. Britain have heard of her compassion, and they called her the Angel of the Crimea. The Crimea War was different to other wars. In fact, the journalists were also reporting there, covering the most horrific findings. It was discovered that 16,000 out of 18,000 soldiers died of preventable diseases, not in battle. But Florence's ability to translate that data into a newer visual style really stood out, and is nowadays known as Nightingale's Rose diagram. It was pioneering at the time and easier demonstrated the efficiency of the diligence of the hygiene and sanitation practices and the simplifications complicated statistics into universal accessible data. This in turn inspired improvements into standards of sanitation and cleanliness, and improvements to hygiene standards for the army are further afield. Florence, despite never having been to India, was outraged at the treatment of the country. She said, "If we are going to occupy their country, then we must have a duty of care to the Indian people. It is wrong that we are there and not helping them." She wanted to be supportive of the people. She was outraged when there was famine in India and would not stop campaigning until the government gave a response and acted. Even Gandhi could be quoted as Florence being an inspiration to himself because of how he felt she represented his country. Florence used her monetary reward in 1860 to fund the establishment of St Thomas Hospital and the Nightingale Training School for nurses. Her nurses would train to top levels, then go and set up their own training schools, quickly spreading around the world. Religion should not play part in nursing, as in a nursing's first concern was to look after the body, not the soul. Florence became well known and revered public figure. She had poems, songs and plays written in her honour, and even now is often referred in films and television, and pictures used to be on the old £10 note. There are statues of her and museums of her accomplishments, and this would probably horrify Florence if she knew right now. Florence became an icon. Young women everywhere inspired to follow in her footsteps. Nursing was no longer seen as a job for the lower classes. Upper classes completely changed their views on nursing, and it became an honourable vocation and viewed as respectable. At her home in Mayfair in 1859, she published another report, Notes on Hospital, which outlined how to run and manage civilian hospitals. During the US Civil War, she consulted on how to best run field hospitals. In 1908, she was 88. Florence was awarded the Merit of Honour by King Edward. In May 1910, she received a message from King George congratulating her on her 90th birthday. Early August 1910, Florence became ill. It seemed to recover quickly until a week later, on Friday the 12th of August, she became very ill with many different symptoms and died suddenly just after lunchtime on Saturday the 13th of August 1910. Unsurprisingly, Florence, who had always hated the spotlight, wanted a quiet, underrated funeral, and despite being offered a lavish funeral and burial place in Westminster Abbey, Florence's family chose to honour her wishes and decline a national funeral, and the Lady of the Lamp was laid to rest in a modest funeral in Hampshire in a family plot. Florence's lifework is now held in the Florence Nightingale Museum, which is located on the site of the original Nightingale Training School for Nurses. The museum is home of more than 2,000 artefacts, well worth the visit. Usually open 10 AM to 5 PM, daily except for Mondays and Tuesdays when it is closed. Some of the information in this video has come from the museum. Florence Nightingale is still to this day held as a pioneer of nursing as we know it today. International Nurses Day is still held every year on Florence's birthday on the 12th of May. Florence, a well-known social reformer and statistician, and again with legacy that is still apparent today. Florence is now laid to rest at St Margaret's Church, East Wellow, Hampshire. Her grave is a family plot adorned with a beautiful large memorial stone with names of her family members on 3 sides. but on one side it simply reads FN, 12th of May 1820, 13th August 1910. No other indication that here lies one of the most inspirational women of recent history. Britain did have their own memorial service for Florence at St Paul's Cathedral. Nurses were bussed in and service took place with mourners from everywhere wanting to pay their respects to the woman that had revelation the world of nursing and far beyond. The hymns were all the same, ones that had been used at the family funeral in Hampshire, but was still among like a funeral and memorial service for a royal. Many of Florence's work went unpublished until after her death, that I haven't covered here. She also received many more awards and accolades than I have referred to. She was such a remarkable woman that this video could go on for days, just noting her many accomplishments. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please give a like and a share, and if you have, maybe subscribe for us. Click the notification buttons. Look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you muchly.